week with an exploration of Boyd's work, an exploration of the overlaps between Boyd's work and the School of Austrian economics. Today we're going to deepen the discussion by actually looking into the axioms of Austrian economics, and we're just going to go through them one by one. So I've been really looking forward to this actually, because Mark sent me over an article which we'll share in the notes about what the axioms actually are. And as I was reading through, there was just so much Boydness popping out at me. So Mark, why don't you just give us a little bit of a framing of this, and then we'll just dive straight into it.
So we had a lot of feedback last week from a lot of different backgrounds. And one of the more interesting ones, of course, was Boyd practitioners that know a lot about Boyd. Many were Marines or retired Marines. And they asked me, hey, this makes sense. Can you send me something that can help me compress my learning curve on the Austrian School of Economics, specifically so I can try to better understand how it relates to Boyd, and they can understand the paper that I had sent them to review that you and I talked about last week that I co-authored with Hunter Hastings from the Economics for Business website and podcast, which we could also link to. And there's if you go on the Mises Institute's website, mises.org, and you click on books and you click on Austrian economics, one of the first things that comes up is an article called Austrian Axioms 101 by Darren Brady Nelson. And it's fairly recent. It was November 27th of 2021. And I think what he does is a really good job of giving a broad brush overview from a high level. Here's 15 things that are characteristic of the Austrian School of Economics that, for those that are interested in learning more, you can go in a lot of different directions, whether it's entrepreneurial theory, or it's monetary theory, or the nature of business cycles, or just the study of human action, which Mises defined as praxeology, the study of human action. There's a lot of different angles to go to. And if you click on the events page on the Mises Institute site, there's the Austrian Economics Research Conference, which is where Hunter and I we're going to present our paper next month. But the resources and tools on Mises are vast, and you could literally stay on that site every day, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and still not read it all. So hopefully by giving an overview, for those that have interest in any of this, they might find an angle of attack that they would find more pertinent to what they're interested in. And again, a lot of it's timely, right? Like there's talk of inflation and talk of markets and business cycles and interest rates and things like that. So there's a lot of that. And we can start from really, I think what Darren's article does a great job of is really refining it down to, hey, if I could sum it up in 15 things as best as I could, which is still very difficult to do, here's 15 things that I would say about the Austrian school, and hopefully that incites some intellectual inquiry and curiosity.
All right, awesome. Well, I mean, I read through them, and I was making links with Boyd's work straight away. So I really like this kind of first principles axiomatic approach. Like I come from after the military, I got into programming, and then after programming, I got into a very esoteric kind of backwater of programming called functional programming, where we basically program with as axiomatic kind of rules and mathematical laws as we can. So I really like the idea of trying to break things down to their most essential elements, and then building theories back up from there. So great. Okay, well let's crack straight on with the first one, which is about human action. And I think this one is, this is the perfect place to start, right? Because we spent so much time last week talking about the capacity for independent action being this kind of almost like biological imperative. So, this is basically that reworded to me. So what do you think about this one?
Yeah, and we might, if people click on the link and see the articles, they'll understand that Darren did a pretty good job of breaking it down into categories. So we would start at the what he calls the Apriori Axioms, the a priori meaning that they're self-evident. Like I don't have to prove them or calculate them. maybe like with Boyd, we'd say in destruction and creation, he talks about the difference between induction and deduction, and a priori is what we can deduce things from. So human action, right? Everything we do is an action, voluntary or involuntary. If I tip my hat, if I grab my coffee, if I get on, I'm constantly acting, and how we act, which I guess we'll get to, but we're constantly seeking to improve our position. It goes back to your comment about the biological imperative. Why do animals act? I mean, they're trying to survive. They're trying to keep up with the rate of change in the environment that they're in, the habitat that they're in. Humans are no different in that respect. Is that what we do? We're acting purposefully to improve our situation. I think on the last episode, I gave the example of I envision being warmer because I'm chilly and I can reach over and grab my fleece and put it on, right? I'm acting purposefully to improve my situation because I want to go from cold to warm. I want to go. Today it's raining. I want to put on a raincoat because I like to stay dry rather than get wet. And those are all the purposes that are behind my actions. We might say with Boyd, my orientation allows me to envision what it would be like dry outside when I'm wet. So I decide to put on my raincoat. I act to do it. I go outside and I realize it's not raining anymore. I take it off. Right? It's a very similar thing. We're constantly trying to improve our situation, and I think it goes in with Boyd's destruction and creation. Why do we destroy and create? Why do we OODA? We're constantly trying to improve our capacity for free and independent action. Yeah. So there's a nice tie in there.
Yeah, and I think also like the primacy of action. I mean, there's some schools of thought that say that you can't really even have cognition without action, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm sitting here, the example I give, right, is if I'm sitting here and I'm holding a pen, right? If I take that out of my eye line and I'm not looking at it and I'm not moving, I can't actually feel that I've got a pen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't feel something or perceive something unless you're moving or you're acting against it, right? So I can feel that this is a pen quite quickly when I start moving my fingers over it. And if I was sitting here just looking at this screen and somehow was able to keep my eyes perfectly still, I wouldn't really be perceiving in the way that we understand vision. So I think it's really interesting to start from this as a first one.
Yeah.
So that's that one. So the other thing about action is that it's scarce, right? Our options are, we never have full independence. We always have prior constraints and resource constraints, and that means that our actions are continually being closed down and opened up. So there's always a scarcity of options available to us. So talk us through this one.
Yeah, for any number of reasons, right? I mean, look at the constraints that we have. You're in England and I'm in Ohio, right? So we have to operate within those constraints. We can't do this meeting in person with anybody that's tuning in or will watch this later. They're going to have to watch it through whatever means are available to them, which are not infinite. They're not endless. We have constraints, whether it's time, money, anything, space, anything that can constrain us. Are going to, I don't want to say inhibit our action, but it's going to constrain our actions to what's possible, given the availability of ends and means. They're not limitless. The things that we can put to use are not infinite or abundant. We don't live in the Garden of Eden where everything is bountiful and there is no scarcity. Now we live in the real world. Scarcity too, there's a lot of schools of economics that will address scarcity. I think of Thomas Sowell has a great book. Thomas Sowell, who's a Marine, by the way, had a great book called Basic Economics. And I think scarcity was one of the very first things that he talks about. And then that'll bring us in, and we'll get into later about choices and decisions, but that's where we start to formulate choices and decisions by what's available to us, which are not, it's not endless.
Yeah, there's another interesting one here as well, especially in the current environment, right? The optionality of action that you have available is not something that you really control in the moment. It's done by preparation, right? That's why the military is so hot on drilling and training and practicing, is because the actions that are available to you are, in a sense, provided by the actions and the preparation that you've made in the past. Right? When you really, really need something and you haven't prepared for it, you're really screwed. If you've prepared for it and something unexpected happens, then the scarcity of action that is available to you is slightly lessened, which is why we prepare.
I like to use the example. You've seen that picture of that. I believe it's an Royal Navy Harrier crashing in Bagram. And there's a picture of the pilot ejecting on the runway. He had a mishap in the landing. And to your point, how many times is that pilot trained for that one way out of that airplane alive to pull that ejection handle and pop out? To talk about scarcity of means. There you go, right there. I've used that a lot in presentations, that picture.
Yeah.
But he's trained for that so many times. I would bet that if you interviewed him, he wouldn't even remember it, because it was so, his orientation, right, implicitly guides and controls his actions. He did that. He could do that in his sleep. Hey, one thing we should probably point out too is that Darren extracted these axioms from the book Understanding the Dollar Crisis by Percy Greaves,
1973.
which it's a great book. It's a series of 7 lectures. You know how when you get a book and you get an endorsement? So there's an endorsement on the back of this book about these 7 lectures are not merely a substitute for textbooks on economics. They're much more, et cetera. And it comes from Ludwig von Mises himself. So this is it's worth pointing out that that's where Darren was extracting these axioms from for his article. So just want to make sure that we credited.
It's interesting that a lot of our kind of raw material that we've both ended up spending a lot of time studying kind of comes from before we were both born.
Yeah, it's funny, and from individuals like Mises and Boyd who didn't get any credit in their own lifetime. It's students or the followers of them like us that carrying on this standard.
Yep. So following on from your example about the Harrier pilot, next axiom is human fallibility, and people make mistakes.
People make mistakes, yeah. I mean, I don't know how much explanation that one needs. If people can't figure that one out, they're in a lot more trouble than they realize. They're proving the axiom. No, we're all fallible. Something might not be the most optimal decision, and through feedback loops, right? When we test our hypothesis, we learn that something didn't work out. We make adjustments. The very nature of fallibility suggests that we are not perfect. We don't act on perfect information. So therefore we can't have perfect action. So we have to be open to the fact that we're going to make errors, and then we have to learn from them. That's the whole point of OODA, the feedback loop. So, but that we could say from the Austrian school, that is a priori, that doesn't need to be proven. It can be, taken as true, and you can deduce from that.
Yeah, I guess one thing to point out though is that the reason that we talk about OODA and the reason that we want to learn about how to operate better is so that you can make your mistakes as small as possible, right? Have many small mistakes that continually test and adjust and move you towards where you want to be, rather than not taking action and storing up all your mistakes and not preparing, and then you end up in the position of making one gigantic mistake that's much more difficult to recover from.
Right.
Cool. All right. So next one, which I might have a few issues with this one. This might be this maybe this material showing its age a little bit, but all people are rational beings. I mean, that's that's gonna need some defending, that one.
Okay, so I'm smiling because this one gets a lot of people. And I admit that when I first got into Austrian economics about almost 20 years ago, I said, all people are rational. Are you kidding me? And it might even be worth reading out of the Greaves book here, but it's basically saying that humans are rational in the sense that they're acting for what they think is best for themselves. Like they think that this is going to improve, or his words are that we're aiming for success. So if we see a bunch of people getting into a bad investment, which we know is shaky or scary, but they're all doing it, like they're all making that choice because they're aiming at some sort of improved condition from where they currently are at. Now, this is worth quoting, and I'm quoting from page 14 of the book. It's very popular to call someone else irrational. Scientifically, the only people who are irrational are people who, in his words, out of their minds, like people that have some sort of a mental impediment, that they're not able to make choices and decisions clearly. That would be rational is the opposite of that. People, in other words, that can make their own decisions, no matter how crazy we think they are or how absurd we think they are. Those people are voluntarily making a decision rationally for what they think is best for themselves, irrespective of our own judgment of it, So I always like to use this story years ago here in the States, the Tickle Me Elmo doll. I mean, people were literally scouring the earth for these absurd toys for their children for Christmas, and they were selling for thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And you and I would say that's irrational, but the way we're saying the word irrational, it doesn't address the rationality of their choice to do something, no matter how ridiculous we think it is. So
yeah,
basically,
Tim's made a good point in the comments here. No, humans are emotional beings as well as rational. So I wonder. So given that this is a book from 1973, given that there's been a huge amount of progress, I guess, in the fields of behavioral economics and neurobiology and all these other studies, like people like Kahneman and Gary Klein, do we think that this one is still axiomatic? I mean, I understand people make rational choices, people act as best they can with what they have, and that can be considered rational. But then there's also all of this kind of, all of our, not particularly good hardware that runs our software, if you like, that kind of makes us, there's a question about sort of objective rationality here and subjective rationality. But there are people that, people do things that are, even themselves would say, shit, that was pretty irrational. Why did I do that?
Well, remember, we're defining rational in this sense as what he says in the book. It's our God-given minds, that, his words, to attain our objectives, right? That's our mind is attaining objective. That's the rational nature of the action. And then continuing on, he says, people make mistakes, yes, but they always choose the means which they think are most likely to attain the ends that they seek. They never aim at failure. Their reasoning may be wrong, but it's their best reasoning. If we want to call somebody else's reasoning irrational because it's mistaken, we had better be careful, because that means that anyone who makes a mistake is irrational. We all make mistakes, and therefore, by our line of reasoning, we're all irrational. So it's not rational in the judgment sense. Like I'm applying a judgment to something that I see that you're doing that I think is just absurd. It's rational in the sense that you're making your cognition is making the rational choice to do something to improve your own situation from your own reasoning, and whether or not I think that's quote unquote irrational is irrelevant. You made the rational choice, and I think that's what he's making sure that we define when we say that humans are rational. We're not saying they're all sane. We're not saying that they're all correct. We're just saying that they're acting on what they reason to be their best choices, assuming they don't have some other kind of mental illness or impediment or things like that.
Okay, cool. I'll buy that. Okay, now we're straight back into Boyd territory here. So action time, right? Now we've got Boyd's conceptual spiral and that other paper, the name of which escapes me, which is talking about Boyd as OODA as a spiral through time. So all actions take time. The perception of the outcomes of those, the perception of the effects of those actions also takes time. The processing of that perception takes time.
Yep.
And then the decision takes time, all of which is time in which the reality of the situation is moving away from you. So yeah, it's important to understand that we don't have immediate feedback. We're not like a mechanical system where you push on a lever and you get the same, the same output immediately. There's delay built into everything, and that's increasingly important actually as the time taken for new technologies to penetrate and change the essentially the ecology of the fitness landscape that we're working in. the time our actions take and the time it takes us to understand the effect of our actions is actually really, really important.
Yeah. Well, and think that everything we just said just occurred and it's already in the past.
Yep.
Everything's occurring in time. OODA is well matched for time-based competition. There's a book, I can't think of the author, but it's called Competing Against Time. And I know that Boyd used that. The Canon of Austrian Economics, if I'm going to say the treatise of Mises, which was Human Action, was his book, his great masterwork, which historically is worth it because he had to leave that behind in Vienna when he was fleeing the Nazis and he escaped to Switzerland before he got to the States. And he rewrote the whole entire thing from memory. And it's one of the most important books ever written on economics. But anyway, chapter 5 of that book is called Time. And the notion, it says that the very word, time is a praxeological factor. In other words, time is a factor of human action. The notion of time, the notion of change implies the notion of a temporal sequence. And I was explaining the OODA loop. You can see on the graphic there, that's occurring in time. From the time I observe to the time I act, that's all occurring in a temporal sequence. And time is interesting too because there are a lot of other economic disciplines that don't factor that in formulas that they use or postulates that they have that they don't necessarily consider things occurring in time. So
now we're talking about time and we're also talking about rationality before. I've just seen another comment from Tim actually that I'm just going to pull up.
Sure.
Because I think this is extremely interesting. So neuroscience shows that decisions run through emotional filters to determine a threat. So this is your observation, right? Your observation is continually scanning and some of the things percolate up and some do not. Once the threat is assessed, then rational thinking kicks in. So there's a whole load of stuff so this feeds into both the last point and this one about time, is because there is a delay inherent in assessing a threat and deciding or allowing that kind of rational thinking circuit to kick in. So kind of interesting that the more rational you are, the more time delay you might be incurring, right? Because the more I've been in multiple companies where there's so much time wasted or spent on trying to build the perfect decision, trying to build the perfect situational awareness, which is highly rational. And all of that time is wasted as soon as the environment moves against you. So I think it's interesting that this is kind of the time and the rationality element of things are both bound up. And I think, the next comment that Tim makes is that Neuro Leadership Institute is building a solid case for this logic, and that's by actually directly observing the activity in the brain. That's very interesting. One of these later episodes, I'd like to bring Carl Friston's work on free energy theory and compare that to some of the OODA things, because that would be directly relevant.
So when I would explain OODA to groups, I always say that, time is the advantage that you gain when your orientation is matched to reality, because the better matched your orientation is, again, implicitly guides your observations and guides your actions. The faster you can figure out what's going on and act on it, the advantage that you gain over your competitors or the rate of change is a time advantage. And this is worth quoting from Mises from that first chapter, chapter 5 of Human Action. He quotes, "He who acts distinguishes between the time before the action, the time absorbed by the action, and the time after the action has been finished. He cannot be neutral with regard to the lapse of time." OODA loop. That's about as good as an explanation of OODA as you get.
And here's another axiom that also follows directly on from that. So the consequences of our actions, right? All the actions that we take, have consequences, large or small. Which 100%. Is the whole point of taking an action in the first place, right? Otherwise, why would you bother?
Well, again, these are deduced from a priori. So again, I don't have to drop a formula in an equation to prove that. Most people should be able to just take that and say, Newton told us, right? Every action has a reaction. Everything has a consequence, and everything we do, good or bad, has consequences. There's nothing that's consequence free. And how do we know that? Through Boyd? Well, we get the feedback. We see something happened, something occurred, something changed.
Yep. And then I guess we're coming back to this kind of, we're still in action, but this one speaks a little bit to scarcity. So we went over action scarcity earlier, right? You don't have complete freedom to act. So therefore you have to make a choice. And, a choice is pretty much the D part of OODA, right? It's choosing, deciding, I guess. Deciding is kind of another word for choice. So you've always got a range of different actions. Your skill or familiarity within a domain will determine how good you are at selecting those actions, and then you always have to choose because you can't do everything at once. And in fact, another very sort of a morbidity I see in many companies is literally trying to do everything at once, like trying to address every opportunity that comes up, and they come up thick and fast these days when there's lots to do, or trying to take on too many projects, which is really an example of not making the right choices, choosing to do one thing well or choosing to do many things not well.
And those would be formulated within your orientation, the things that you sift through, the things that you evaluate, the options that you're thinking of or considering would all be within your orientation, whereupon you formulate your decision and ultimately your action. I think it's another good, it's another good corollary between the two schools of thought.
Yep.
But we think, why do we choose? Why do we decide? Why do we act? Well, following Boyd through destruction and creation, we're seeking to improve our capacity for independent action.
Yep.
It's basically saying the same thing.
Just chimed in with another very useful comment here as well. Cognitive biases determine the range of action. That's very, very true.
So I love that graphic. I've seen it all over. The one site that I can think of, it's I think it's yourbias.is. Your bias is. There's another one in Visual Capitalist, and it has 100. I think it's 188 cognitive biases, and those are worth pointing out. And I agree with what Tim is saying, because those reside inside of our orientation, and they're going to directly affect how we observe, how we decide, and how we act, and those are going to have a direct effect on our action choices, as the Austrians would say.
Yep. Bias is going to obviously because the OODA diagram is behind the both of us on this video, but one of the most important lines in that is the implicit guidance and control line that goes from orientation to observation. So our cognitive biases both determine the range of action, but they also filter our observation. So that is an incredibly important point. Okay, and then this next one follows on, right? The action ideas, right? This is pure orientation. We take action based on the ideas that we have, our mental models, if you like, or our model of the world, and we have an idea about the actions that will be most effective. I use an example from the martial arts on this. So back before lockdown, I used to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and when I'm training with somebody who's a higher belt than me, the reason I get beaten so fast and comprehensively is because their 3D mental model about how their bodies move, how my body moves, how that interplay happens and unfolds, just has a much, much higher fidelity than mine does, and the ideas about what actions they take and the outcomes that follow those actions are also much more accurate than mine. So I'm flailing around being imprecise, and their actions and orientation is leading to action that is much more precise and leading them to ever better position, ever better capacity for independent action against me. And it's a perfect kind of microcosm of many, many different types of human activity, really.
And when you think of orientation, one of the 5 things that Boyd said was like previous experience, right? When you're going against somebody with a higher belt, it could probably be implied that they have more experience that they're generating ideas from to act on when they're confronting somebody in a ring, that has a different belt than they do. It goes back to the point that Tim made about biases. Biases shape ideas too, and they're again occurring within orientation, and they implicitly will guide and control how we see things as circumstances unfold.
Yeah, well, it's interesting actually. Even in you could consider training a kind of bias, right? So a thing you'll often see in street fights is people trying to do headlocks and things like that. And that's a natural. I've seen it all the time. I used to work on the doors of some quite rough clubs when I was younger, and that was always the go-to move. But actually, when you train jiu-jitsu, you learn immediately, very quickly, that you learn a bias that is going to get you in trouble because it's a shitty move to use. It doesn't work very well.
I'm amazed how many OODA practitioners, or how many either practice Brazilian jiu-jitsu, or how Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioners can understand OODA when I've talked to them about it. They get it almost immediately. That's a different conversation. We'll have to get a BJJ master on.
No, that would be cool.
Yeah.
Or maybe even do like I go back to my old dojo when COVID's a bit less prevalent, and get some woman who weighs half as much as me to kick my ass as a demonstration.
Hey, it's two pitted orientations, right? One orientation who can observe orient decide to act faster. So
it's like, I mean, I've rolled with plenty of women that have literally been half of my weight, and it's just it's fascinating to be. Anyway, I would digress.
Well, you think about again, like you're looking at orientation versus orientation, and we can use some of these axioms, right? They have certain choices that they operate within their constraints. You have certain choices that you operate within your constraints, and then you try to maximize those as best as you can, as fast as possible, before the other person can figure out what's going on. It works in jiu-jitsu, it works in entrepreneurial theory.
Yeah, it's a very, very immediate fitness landscape in jiu-jitsu as well.
Yep. So those are the axioms of like a priori and deduced.
Okay.
So now we would go to number 9, right?
The value and exchange axioms.
Value
ordinal value. Tell us about the value scales and ordinal value.
Tell me your 3 favorite flavors of ice cream.
So
if you like ice cream, if you don't like ice cream, pick something else.
No, I do like ice cream.
All right.
I was just trying to think of ones that weren't too gluttonous, but I'm always stealing my daughter's fish food flavor. And I also like salted caramel. And I guess vanilla would be the next one.
Would you rank them that order? So fish food number 1, salted caramel number 2, vanilla number 3. Okay.
Yep.
Can you tell me, could you say that you like fish food? So clearly you like fish food more than salted caramel. And when you say fish food, I think you're talking PHISH from Ben & Jerry's, which is pretty good. Can you tell me how much more you like it than salted caramel? Salted caramel is your number 2. Are you able to give me a measurable, quantifiable amount or scale to show me some kind of a quantitative difference between 1 and 2? Can you prove on paper why you like fish food more than salted caramel?
Probably not. I don't have that much of a preference.
Because our value scales are ordinal, not cardinal.
Right.
I can't say that I like fish food 10 times more than salted caramel. I could never prove that. It's impossible to prove. And there are various schools of economics that say, well, there's this thing called a util, UTIL, and you have so many utils, and you say, like, I like fish food 20 more utils than I do salted caramel. It's impossible. Basically, what it means within your ordinal scale, your own unique preference, because I might think fish food's disgusting, or I might think I prefer Cherry Garcia over fish food, right? But I can't quantify that. I can't mathematically prove why I like Cherry Garcia better than fish food, right? You can't do that. In other words, your value scales are always going to be ordinal. I choose one thing over the other, but I can't quantify that with a weight,
Hmm.
you know, unless I said, well, I prefer 5 pounds more of gold over 2 pounds of gold. You know, that's a different, I think it's a different discussion. But when it comes to preference, my personal preference, my personal value judgment, that scale's ordinal. It's not cardinal.
Interesting.
Like we're Marines, right? Like we would say, what's your favorite branch of the military? Marines, right? Royal Marines for you, Marine Corps for me. What's your second favorite?
I mean, that's just objective truth. That's not
That
anything about
well, true, but
objective values.
that's true. But number two, we'd probably say the Navy because we're connected and we're close. But I can't say that I love the Marines 100 more times than I can't prove that. You know, I have a personal preference that comes from my own orientation, and that's I can rank it, but I can't prove it mathematically, or I can't show it with any type of, you know, quantitative measure.
That's quite interesting. So that one of the things that's coming up for me when you're saying that is that, you know, making, and this is a kind of computational thing as well, making an ordinal determination is actually very quick, intuitive. It's one of those implicit guidance and control things. It's a snap judgment, whereas the other version of like coming up with a quantitative cardinal scale on which to put things is much more high energy, because you have to actually do a calculation and think. So that's quite interesting that, you know, the having ordinal value scales might speak to the speed of making decisions or making choices.
Yes, and there's no way to prove why your scale is your scale and why my scale is my scale. It just boils down to our subjective personal preference, because we'll come to it later. Value is subjective, but that preference is also subjective, and it comes from each person's uniqueness and their own taste for things, their own preference. And you might have any reason, like you said, you know, you like to steal it from your daughter. Like it might trigger some feeling like why I like that over vanilla, right? You know, but still, that's still all just,
yeah,
you know, you can't mathematically prove that. So
okay, cool. All right, so before we get on to subjective value, then let's look at marginal value. So this seems to be much more in the kind of realm of traditional economics here, like almost like sort of a mathematical model. So talk us through this one.
So one of the father or founder of the modern Austrian school was Karl Menger, Menger, from Vienna. And it should be noted too why it's called the Austrian school. It was actually like an epithet or like an insult from the German school. You know, that's what the Austrians do. You know, so it was kind of an insult, which became the name. But anyway, there's something called the Marginal Revolution, and there are people that are much more qualified to talk about it than me. But Menger, Walras, Leon Walras, economist, Walras, and one other one that I'm just drawing a blank on all of a sudden. I want to say it was Alfred Marshall, but I'm not sure. Basically proved that value decisions are made on the margin, right? Fish food's valuable to you, but the more fish food you eat, the value diminishes, right? Like you could probably eat a couple of scoops, but if you had to eat a whole tub or 2 tubs or 3, each additional unit, the value, the value diminishes. And this is like the marginal value. We could do multiple episodes just on this topic, so I'll try to keep this brief. But this is a big differentiator between Adam Smith and the labor theory of value. Like he had what was called the diamond water paradox. Like in the Wealth of Nations, he couldn't understand why people would prefer diamonds over water, because diamonds don't have any utility. You need water. You need water to live. And he came up with that value was derived from the labor that we put into it. Well, that pathway led right to Karl Marx, who says that, again, the labor theory of value, the value of something is in the labor from the workers that went into it. All Karl Marx did was take Adam Smith, and you can read the Communist Manifesto, and you can see for yourself what Karl Marx says about capitalism. Whereas Menger, Walras, and again, I'd have to Google it really fast, but I want to say it's Alfred Marshall. They came up with almost simultaneously in completely different schools. Walras was more of a mathematical economist. Menger was more of a praxeological, Aristotelian, human action. They all came up with this theory that decisions of value are made on the margins. And again, we could go on for hours about that. And I would need to read off more stuff because it's like I get the basics of it. Like again, the basics would be, and I'm gonna get like emails from plenty of people I know that I know through the Austrian school. But that additional fish food, you like that fish food, but the value is going to diminish the more and more of it you eat.
Yeah,
you would
So there's something interesting here that the so in machine learning and sort of mathematical models of the neuron, there's this thing called the sigmoid function, which is you don't really, when you have like a neural net or something like that, the individual switches, they don't have a binary on and off state. They have a sigmoid function which moves, has a much steeper slope in the middle, and then it kind of tails off at the edges. So that's almost. Anyway, I think we could go down a rabbit hole here. So maybe let's just move on.
So I'll close with this. So it was indeed Marshall. So it was Marshall, Walras, and Menger who was the sort of the founder of the modern Austrian school. But it says marginalism is the theory of economics that attempts to explain the discrepancy in the value of goods and services by reference to their secondary or marginal utility. The reason why the price of diamonds is higher than that of water, for example, owes to the greater additional satisfaction of the diamonds over the water. Thus, while the water has greater total utility, the diamonds have greater marginal utility. And what's really interesting about this, there's an Austrian economist by the name of Murray Rothbard, and he was a student of Mises, and he wrote 2 massive volumes of the history of economic thought. Adam Smith actually came up with this and could explain it in, I want to say that the book was called something like The Theory of Moral Sentiments, maybe. But when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he completely forgot what he had already previously written, made value attributed to the individual labor put into it, which again cleared the way for Marx and the labor theory of value. But
okay, cool.
But that additional unit of fish food's the value's not gonna go up. It's gonna go down.
All right, I'll tell my daughter that next time she's
maybe it's entropy
and not looking like she's slowing down.
There you go.
Okay. So let's move on.
So we can plow through these ones pretty quick.
Yeah.
Subjective value. Yeah, we talked about that. I mean, your scale is different from my scale. Even if we're Marines, or even if we're in there with our teammates or people we work with, or even family members, we align at some point. But at the end of the day, all of our preferences are going to be unique to us because we're all unique.
Yeah.
And
so
our tastes.
I've got a little joke about this, which sums up this.
Okay.
This one really well. So there's a Taliban is crawling through the desert, dying of thirst, and he comes upon a Royal Marine standing on a sand dune, and he's have mercy, where is there any water? And the Royal Marine says there's water a kilometer that direction. And the Taliban says, can you sell me a cup? He's got a cup on him. He said, no, I can sell you a tie. And the Taliban's like, what the hell do I want a tie for? Give me the cup. And he says, well, sorry, I need the cup. And so the Taliban's like screams 1,000 curses on him and crawls off to try and go onto this to the water at the officer's mess. And then about 3 hours later, he crawls back saying, okay, I'll buy the tie. They wouldn't let me in without one. So I butchered that terribly, but
everything's subjective.
That there's different things that are valuable depending on your knowledge of those things and depending on the time, and these things are always in constant flux and moving, as I think we discussed last week.
I mean, think about the football club you support, right? It's a subjective preference.
I'm not a soccer player.
But over here, like I'm from Pittsburgh. I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, but at the end of the day, it's a subjective preference that I prefer them over the Cleveland Browns or whatever. But I'm drinking black coffee right now. I know people that can't stand coffee without anything in it, but my own personal preference, I value black coffee more than I do coffee with stuff in it. So, but that is, so what Darren points out from the Greaves book is that different people have, different value scales and, at different times, we value things differently during, a wool coat, a wool sweater is great in the winter. It's not so great in the summer.
Okay, moving on. So the next one is exchange value. So this is interesting that, there's not going to be any exchange if there's no differential of, if both people have the same value that they place on something and they're happy with where it is currently, then there's not going to be any exchange. So there has to be mutual advantage, which means there has to be a different value scale.
This is a massive Austrian point, what you just brought up. All free exchange is to the mutual advantage of the buyer and the seller, because if you sell me a gallon of fish food ice cream, what's a gallon of fish food ice cream cost in the UK?
I don't even know what a gallon is in the UK.
Oh, that's right. You guys don't use the English system anymore in England. we use that here. Yeah. Okay, a liter of or let's just say, let's keep it simple. I'm a Ferrari dealer, right? And I'm going to sell you a Ferrari. What's it going to cost you? Like for a nice, maybe like a 2012 F450, something that's kind of a little vintage, nice. Let's say it costs you 500,000 pounds, right? That's what I'm charging to sell that Ferrari, right? 500,000 pounds. And we exchange. I trade you the Ferrari. You give me the 500,000 pounds. Yep. Look at our value scales. What was number one for me? What was number one for you?
The Ferrari for me. And
number one for me was the 500,000 pounds.
Yep.
Number two for you was the 500,000 pounds. Number two for me was the Ferrari. So I ranked the 500,000 pounds over the Ferrari. We had an exchange, a free voluntary exchange. We're both better off.
Yep.
That's my explanation of exchange value, that when you're exchanging freely, whatever you exchange for, and you weren't coerced or anything like that, whatever you traded for, you valued that more than what you received for it, and vice versa. So again, you just limit it to 500,000 pounds in a Ferrari. I rank it 1-2, you rank it 1-2 a different way.
Yep.
And thus we have an exchange, and we're both better off. You got the Ferrari, I got the 500,000 pounds.
Yep. Which leads us on to this one, which is that you only exchange if there's an advantage in it for you, and I guess by
perceived advantage,
by implication, a mutual advantage for all the parties involved in the exchange.
Right. Yep. For every buy, there's a sell. For every sell, there's a buy. We're constantly making trade-offs for one set of conditions for the next. That we're whether it's monetary exchange, whether it's any other type of exchange. We're constantly seeking to trade one set of one situation for another, or one position for an improved position.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. And then I guess this one is almost the same thing, right? You're gonna, well, I'll let you talk through this one.
Man will exchange people will exchange for a greater advantage in preference to an exchange for a lesser advantage. I'd rather wait to have the fish food because I rank it higher than the salted caramel. So when I go to the grocery store and they don't have fish food, or it's coming off the truck and I have to wait 20 minutes, maybe I'll prefer that over the lesser the lesser exchange of just taking what they have and then leaving.
Yeah. So I guess that, when we think about back to capacity for independent action, this is both this one, the previous one, and the the last one that's coming up in a minute are all about capacity, right? You if there is there's a binary, is this advantageous or not? And then there's a capacity question of how advantageous is it?
Yeah.
And that's a multivariate calculation that you have to do on the fly all the time.
So here's Greaves from the book. You'll exchange for a greater advantage in preference to an exchange for a lesser advantage. If you can buy something for 250 pounds, you're not going to pay 275 pounds. You'll always take that price. You will always take that price which gives you the greatest advantage. Or, like my wife's great at this. Well, wait till it goes on sale. And she's almost always right. You can get the same exact thing for a much cheaper price. That's our preference for. I want to exchange ideally for a greater.
Yeah, so that's
advantage.
interesting. I think there's quite a big assumption there in that we're able to make that determination, because I think when you get into sort of pricing psychology and Robert Cialdini's ideas and things like that, right? There are people in this world who will buy the thing that costs the most because, I don't know, makes them feel good, or it gives them more reassurance. So I think this one is perhaps another one of these things that is true in the abstract, but actually when you get into the messy real world and all of our kind of glitchy hardware gets into the mix, it maybe doesn't quite pan out that way all the time. But again, we're into that kind of pseudo philosophical question about rationality there. So I think, I can agree. I can agree in principle. I think maybe in practice it's slightly more messy.
Potentially because, or possibly because of the fact that there's so many distortions within exchange that the signal might not always be clear. Of course, there's that famous term in economics, other things being equal, when all else is equal, the Latin term is ceteris paribus. But that's not the goal of, Austrian economics. At least I understand it. The goal is not equilibrium. There's, it's nothing that can really be attained because of all the things that we're talking about, because there are mistakes, there are different value scales, there are, different personal preferences. People value things differently. And I hope what people would take away is that when they look at economic things where there's an over aggregation of groups or consumers or, manufacturers, when things get aggregated, we're forgetting that Boyd, right? People, ideas, things. We're forgetting that there's individuals in every single one of those scenarios that all have different preferences, that all do things for different reasons, that all have different tastes, et cetera. So, so that's one of the big differentiators when inquiring into Austrian economics that you're going to realize is that there's no aggregation of groups per se. They don't really do that. So, because again,
Kyle's got an interesting comment in the chat, is that best advantage isn't always financial, right? So there's multiple different social,
moral, ethical, physical,
all of those things that that people are constantly evaluating. Not just people, actually, primates and probably other social creatures are always evaluating. It's not just about I saw a video the other day this morning, I think it was, of a dolphin teasing a seagull with a fish. Right? There's absolutely no economic or energy advantage in that, other than just sheer amusement and being a dick. And sometimes we do things for those reasons.
Yeah.
Like eating my dog.
Yeah, because everybody's value scales are different. Everybody's value is subjective. They get different feelings from things different rewards. You've heard the term. I mean, in the Marines, they would talk about there's financial salary, which in the Marine Corps was never great. Nobody goes in the Marine Corps for the money. I can imagine nobody goes into the Royal Marines for the money.
Nope, absolutely not.
you go in for the psychological salary. You go in for the intangible salary. And, I think Kyle's point is really interesting in the sense that the best advantage is not always financial. Well, like OODA, like Boyd's ideas, I think that there's a universality behind the Austrian principles because they can apply to so many different areas. If I'm exchanging, right, if I'm hot and I'm going to take this top off, right, exchange is occurring. It doesn't necessarily, as Kyle says, it's not always a financial thing.
Yeah.
We're constantly making exchanges and trade-offs. Money's an area that you can easily see it, but it's not always the case. We're constantly exchanging conditions throughout the day. We're going from hungry to content. We're going from thirsty to not thirsty. So we're constantly trading and exchanging.
Yeah. So it's that capacity for independent action, right? Sometimes and oftentimes in the modern world, that capacity for independent action is measured with a financial instrument of some sort, but it's not the only measure of economic or other types of value. Okay, so last one then. I think we already covered this one actually. It's it's a question of scale. Like you would maximize your advantage where it's all possible to the extent that you are able to perceive that you're doing so.
Yeah, again, I was trying to think of a easily relatable example. The weather, if I'm going to go out and get the mail out front and it's freezing outside, I can't find my big, thick wool coat, but I do have this fleece jacket that's quick. Okay, I'll do that because it's better than just going outside in my t-shirt, So I'll make a smaller exchange rather than none at all, I suppose.
Yep. So I think there was one more in the chat actually that I just noticed that I didn't address at the time. This was from Tim. I don't know if he's still around, but let's just cover this one off before we wrap up, because I think it's quite an interesting question. How
does scarcity play into marginal value? There's an economist out there that's got the answer like right now. At the moment, I'm not that economist, so I'm thinking like, how does scarcity play into marginal value?
So it's interesting that there's scarcity at the time, right? So I think my take on this would be the marginal value of a scarce resource would be probably higher, or that. Oh, well, he's still here.
Yeah, I got it. Go ahead. I got my answer.
The marginal value of something that is scarce would be higher,
like a diamond.
Yeah, but also the marginal value that your orientation tells you is going to be scarce in the future is also higher, right? So
yeah.
So okay, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, how does scarcity play a role in marginal utility? Well, that's why a diamond has more utility than water, right? To say us, right? Like, so we would say that water has a greater total utility because it's life, where our bodies are made up of mostly water. However, the marginal utility, the diamond has a greater marginal utility. It's more scarce, therefore we might assign more value to it subjectively than we would the water. Now, go back to your example of being in the desert. I probably could care less about diamonds. The scarcity of water is going to have a much higher value than it does for me, under normal conditions. I say normal conditions, I mean here in a house where I have it coming out of my tap and it's filtered and that kind of a thing. Yeah. I always used to, I've asked, like, how does scarcity play into marginal value? Think of the last meal that you had, right? And think of the last meal that you sat down with your family. Did you have leftovers? I mean, we do. I have, 4 teenagers, 4 high schoolers. They're all athletes. They eat a lot of food and they don't always eat everything. So we have leftovers. But you think in certain areas, those leftovers could feed a whole family for a month, maybe, and the food would have a much higher value due to its scarcity. If I was in a different region of the world, I mean, a lot of places that I went into the Marines, a bottle of filtered water is more preferable than gold. because the filtered, clean, healthy drinking water that doesn't have any parasites, it doesn't have any disease, that's scarce. So it's going to have a much higher marginal value than water to someone in an office building in downtown London.
Yep.
So I think that's the answer to Tim's question.
Yeah.
Everything is about everything's about context, or as the axioms pointed out, I would say everything's about the constraints that we have, that the resources that are available, the situations that we find ourselves in, the subjective preferences. So you could umbrella that under context, sure. And if I wanted to have some technical economic terms, then I would throw in a lot of the things that we were talking about.
Yeah. And I guess, everything is about context. That's the whole reason why we care about OODA in the first place, right? Because
that's it.
It's our orientation that allows us to navigate those shifts in context and improve all of the, back to the first one, the first axiom of essentially improving independent action.
Yes, and I would agree with that, and I would agree with Tim and say that it's how we assign meaning, right? These are ways that we apply meaning to chaos, basically, right? This is how we create our orientation, our subjective preferences, our value scales. That's how we apply meaning to the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity that we're awash in every day.
Yep.
Very good point, Tim. Thank you for that question or point.
Yeah. Well, that was cool. I think we've pretty much come to the end of this one.
Right on an hour.
Yeah, pretty much. So what are we going to tackle next then, Mark?
Well, we were talking about every week, having a book to recommend. If you go on the Mises Institute's website, which I know you'll link to, you can find this article with a link to the book. The overwhelming majority of the books in the canon of the Austrian School of Economics are completely available from the Mises Institute online. If you have an EPUB or PDF format, you can read them in HTML format. The content is unbelievable. It's a massive library that you can literally spend hours on if you have inquiry. Of course, you can see the article that Hunter did with me about OODA loop and the adaptive entrepreneurial method, and you can also link to our podcast. And I think when you understand this, when you dig into Austrian economics, I mean, you see it goes into a lot of different directions, and it's a fairly big tent. There's a lot of people from a lot of different perspectives that come to it from very different angles. And there's a lot, I mean, those 3 shelves right there, it's riddled. And I don't even think I have a quarter of the books that are available on the Mises Institute's website. So
is The Origin of Wealth one of those books by Eric Beinhocker? It's not really Austrian, but
no, it's not. I don't think that would be in there. I mean, when you go on the site, you can see, like, you can click on authors. They'll break it into categories. You can even get free copies sent to you of Economics in One Lesson, which is a tremendous book by Henry Hazlitt. I give that out to people all the time. You can order them from the Mises Institute, and I hand them out. And basically what the Boyd corollary with that book is basically that you can't just focus on what you can see. You also have to anticipate what you don't see. And the classic example in economics is called the broken window fallacy. So if I'm walking down the street and somebody throws a brick through a baker's window, we say, oh, great, a broken window. The glass man, the glass company is going to be able to put a new window in there, and they're going to benefit, and they're going to get money for that broken window that the vandal broke the window or whatever. But what we didn't see was the same capital was going to be to improve the ovens to reduce the price of the bread because they were going to be able to make more bread. Now I can't spend that on upgrading my bakery. I have to spend that money on the new window. So, like, we don't see that. And like the angle of the book is that the good economist or the true economics is really trying to understand and anticipate what you can't see and being aware of the complexity of things, because things are so interconnected and networked. It's
that's really interesting, actually, because that's
Yeah.
something that I come up against all the time.
How so?
Well, people always talk about the risk of making changes, especially in like complex IT systems and financial systems. So the focus is always on, what are the risks of making this change? Completely ignoring the elephant in the room, that if you don't move fast, the risk is that you're overtaken and you become completely irrelevant anyway.
Right.
And that's, I guess, an example of that kind of unknown or unseen area of, it's not really a risk. Well, I guess we're back into Boyd, right? It's you have to remain current with your environment. As soon as you fall off of that kind of familiarity and that kind of fluidity of being with your environment,
it's the opportunity cost.
Yeah.
Right. It's the loss of value from something that would have been incurred that is not, because I had to do something else. So if I'm the baker and I've got this grand design, we're gonna redo the ovens. We have a better process to make bread cheaper for our consumers, our customers. But now I had to divert all that money to the new window.
So I think this is slightly different. So this is the example of the window is you're reacting to something that's happened that you have to do.
Well, I walked down and I saw that. Like, I saw the glass company get paid by the baker for putting in a new window. But what I didn't see, or what I'm not thinking about, is the fact that the capital that he used to replace the window would have been used to update their ovens, which would have reduced my bread prices when I go to the baker to bread. So it sets off a whole nother chain of events.
Yeah.
Because of that one thing. There's a great it was on a Mises lecture, and I have to think of who exactly it was. I don't remember, but he said, if the broken windows fallacy were true, wouldn't it be better as me and an economic professor if we went into downtown and we just start breaking all the windows, and everybody would say, hey, great, hey, the economy's going to get better because these economic students are running around breaking all the windows and they're destroying all this property. So guess what? They're going to have to go buy new windows, and they're going to have to, it doesn't work like that. All that capital gets diverted away from an intent that we weren't aware of, or we didn't see. And that's the loss of, that's the opportunity cost, right? I lost the benefit of being able to update my baking system to reduce the prices for my customers because I had to pay for a new storefront that got destroyed.
Cool. All right. Well, look, I think we've beaten this horse to death.
What are you reading these days? Anything?
I'm reading. I'm halfway through reading The Dawn of Everything by Graeber, which is really, really interesting. Actually, I kind of fell off the wagon reading before Christmas, and I've been horrifically busy with work, so I haven't really kind of carved out the time to get back into it. But it's a really interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, Graeber's had a lot to say about economics in the past. So I guess it's really a book about humanity and economics. It's really interesting. I must get back to it.
I'll have to give that one a look.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you, thank you, Mark. Thank you to everyone in the chat. It's been some really good points coming up, and I'm glad that we've got the software I'm using for this, by the way, is Restream. So I've been sort of monitoring the chat in the overlay and in the sidebar here. And thanks to Tim and Kyle for your comments. And catch you all next time, hopefully. All right.